What's up, guys? Sky here with episode number 2 of Broke Girls Art School, and today I'll be showing you how to seal and epoxy an unfinished piece of wood. So the project that I will be sealing and epoxying today will be this dog burn of cute puppy Maddie, and then this is the effect that the epoxy gives. So you get that nice gloss luster. It's almost like a layer of glass on top. So I'm going to be going through some tips and pointers and hacks that I have learned along the way and hopefully teach you something new. All right, so the first step that I like to take before epoxying one of my wood burns is I'll seal the wood first, because my first couple of times using epoxy, I noticed that if you don't seal it right off the bat, then for example, like all these soft shades in the face, it decreases the contrast because it darkens the color of the wood. So you can avoid that by using some sort of either spray sealant, or my personal favorite to use is Mod Podge, because I feel like it doesn't affect the darkness of the wood and it just leaves it pretty much the same tones. Some of these work pretty well, the sprays. I have like a clear polyethylene. Also darkens up the wood just a smidge, so it lessens that contrast that much more. My favorite spray was the Americana Sealer and Finisher, but one piece of advice I would definitely give with this is to make sure you shake it very well before using it. There was one project I used where I sprayed it without shaking it that well, and it left like a white film over the top. So then I had to, spend a bunch of time scrubbing off the sealant and then re-burning over some of the areas, and it was just a giant pain. So again, my favorite method of sealing the wood is Mod Podge, which is basically just kind of like glue that's made to seal art projects. There's different kinds. There's like a gloss Mod Podge, but my favorite is just the matte, especially since we're going under epoxy, which already adds tons of shine. So next I'm gonna show you how to use the Mod Podge. Usually when I'm using it, I like to get a bigger paintbrush that has pretty smooth bristles, so you can get a nice even coating on there. And when you put the coat on, you don't want it to be too thick. You want it to be nice and thin, but still thick enough to where you can see that it's covering the whole piece evenly. So let me get my camera set up and I'll show you guys how I do the Mod Podge. Alrighty, so another thing I would recommend when you're using Mod Podge, when you first open it, cut a little triangle in there, if you can see. It makes it easier to pour, so you have more control over how much is going on the piece. So for this size, it's about 12 by 8 inches. So I'm gonna wanna pour circle about that big in the middle here, and then make sure you have a clean brush with no debris on it. And then we're gonna spread that Mod Podge around. Another thing, I would make sure that you have paper towel and a toothpick nearby, because I don't know about you guys, but I have 2 dogs that shed a ton. So, it's not uncommon for me to get some dog hair in this while I'm working. So I wanna make sure I always have a toothpick nearby to fish that stuff out. So let's get started. Another thing that can happen when you're getting towards the end of your bottle with the Mod Podge, the material can start to kind of clump. You can kind of see right here, there's a little clump of glue. Another thing, just, pick them out as you go. Don't get freaked out or anything. But you want to spread it pretty quickly because this stuff does dry fast. We got another clump of glue right there. And then a thing that I like to do with a lot of my portrait burns is I'll do like that nice soft or sometimes even dark torch around the edges, just to give it something in the background. And when you do use a torch for your wood burn, the wood absorbs whatever sealant or, Mod Podge, for example, that you're putting on there. So if you have, if you use torches in your burns, then I would definitely recommend you know, doing a little bit heavier of a coat. You can do layers with Mod Podge as well if need be. Usually one layer is good though if you do it, you know, the right thickness. And I like to smooth it out with vertical strokes because I feel like that's the way you can get the smoothest coat without any bumps or anything. So if you're going around like this and then it dries like that, you're still gonna see that underneath your underneath the epoxy. And I always make sure I go all the way out to the edges. Got another dog hair. And sometimes if you brush on the edges, if it's live edge on these with the bark, it can get caught on your paintbrush. And you don't want to have little debris sitting on here, so just try to keep an eye on that. That's what I did here. I got all these little debris that landed in. Just go back and smooth over that. All right, so that should give you an idea of how thick the coat should be, and I usually like to keep smoothing it out until it starts to clump, and you'll notice as you're brushing, you know, if the glue gets too dry, then you'll start getting bumps and they're harder and harder to smooth out. So if you get to that point, I would just stop what you're doing, let it dry, and then add another layer if you need to smooth it out. Alrighty, so now I'm gonna pop this on a time lapse real quick so you guys can see what it looks like as it dries, and I will be back in a few minutes. All right, guys, so now that our Mod Podge is all dried up, I started getting set up for the epoxy next. The brand that I like to use, it's a 1-to-1 mix ratio. This is amazing clear cast. You can find it at Michael's or Hobby Lobby. And some other things that you're gonna want, 2 cups to do the mixing. I like wearing a pair of gloves just because you do not want this stuff on your hands or on anything else besides your project because it will ruin whatever it touches. You're gonna want to level so that way you can make sure that your burn before you pour the epoxy is level. Definitely check it vertically and horizontally and make sure that that bubble's in the middle because you don't want this to be on a tilt and then have the epoxy drain off the side while it's wet. Couple toothpicks again in case anything, you know, dust, debris happens to land on that while you're working. Tongue depressors to do the mixing of the epoxy and to smear it on evenly. Another thing I would recommend investing in, especially if you're working just out of your house in a smaller room, to get one of these masks, a little bit more heavy duty than your average one, because when you're mixing the epoxy, sometimes there's bubbles that can form and float around in the air and you just don't want to breathe in those chemicals. So, and another part of my setup, so underneath the wood burn here, I just have a couple of these guys, one for the bottom, one for the top, and then I laid down a garbage bag underneath, and then just these little 4-ounce cups to have it stood up because you don't want your project, you know, just laying flat because all that stuff that pulls on the side, you don't want it to be attached to your project. So here we are. I'm going to double check this again to make sure it is level. It's not quite in the center, so we'll fix that. All right, so now that we have our project level, I'm gonna pour out the epoxy. So you wanna make sure, most important part, make sure you have completely equal ratio. If you have, you know, more of part A, then part B, then it could make the epoxy not cure totally, so it'll never fully dry. So you want to make sure that you have a perfect ratio, so there's the proper like chemical reaction and it hardens and dries the way you want, because there's nothing worse than spending hours and hours on a project and then ruining it with the last step. So follow the directions. I know it's a pain, but you want to make sure that you're doing it right. Alrighty. So I personally, especially for, you know, projects that aren't that big, like this size, like using smaller clear cups when I'm doing the measuring, because I've used like the big red Solo cups before, and it's really hard to tell sometimes if your pour is even when you use those. So we'll get this here. When you are mixing the epoxy, you want to make sure you mix it for approximately 3 minutes. Usually a good teller is when there's a bunch of bubbles in there, because that means that, you know, they've been mixed properly. Make sure these are even. Alrighty. So then when I pour these together, I know they're even. Then I'll grab a bigger cup, because sometimes with these small ones, if you're trying to mix it, you don't want it spilling over the edge. So let me grab a bigger cup real quick to mix these. Get back on over here. All right, so I'm gonna put this in a time lapse real quick while I mix, and then I'll be back in a minute. That one. All right, so another thing that you want to do before you pour, make sure that you wipe the edges of the cup, scrape the edges in the bottom of the cup, and wipe the sides of the stick that you're using to mix, because you don't want to build up at all before you pour. All right, here we go. So I like to pour out from the middle and then take my way out to the edges. All right, so we got a nice pretty thick coat, and I can take that and make sure I spread it all the way out to the very edge. And it's all right if it drips over, because after the epoxy dries, you can take a sander and just sand down the drips on the back. It's no biggie. All right. So now that we have the epoxy out to all of the edges, you can take some sort of flashlight. You can just use your phone or whatever you have handy and go through and make sure you don't see any hairs or anything, or dust, whatever. And another thing I would say that is worth investing in is one of these torches to pop all the bubbles. They're like 12 bucks on Amazon. You can get one of these torches and then buy some of this butane. And it's super easy to fill up. Insert it there, hold it for a couple seconds, And then you can use that to pop all the bubbles. And I would keep an eye on it for maybe 10 minutes or so, and every couple of minutes run over it with the torch again, because you won't pop all the bubbles in one go. You gotta kind of wait for all of them to rise to the surface. And it does go a lot quicker with the torch. If you do not have a torch handy, you can also use one of these long lighters. Just light it up and go along the surface. Don't hold it in one spot for too long. Another method you could use to pop the bubbles is just to exhale over it, but again, I don't recommend that because I think it's better to have a mask on and not breathe in all of these chemicals. I'll go over that again with the torch. And in here, if there's a bubble stuck at the bottom, like where I did this lettering in the name, there's a couple bubbles that are stuck in there in the divots. So you can go in there with a toothpick and kind of shake them loose so they float up to the top. I'm gonna go over with my flashlight again, make sure nothing has floated in here since I started. I got a few more bubbles that I got to rise to the surface. All right, so now that it's looking like all of our bubbles are popped, I'm gonna go ahead and just set this cover right on top to make sure that nothing floats in our wet epoxy. All right, so now that we have our epoxy all laid out, we have all the bubbles popped, you're gonna wanna let this sit in the same spot for anywhere from 24 to 48 hours while the epoxy cures. Not worth it to risk it. I would just leave it in there for a couple days. You don't wanna risk touching it and leave a fingerprint or something like that. So thanks you guys for swinging by for episode number 2 of Broke Girls Art School. Drop a comment, let me know what you thought, what you'd like to see in the future, and hit subscribe if you want to see some more videos. Have a good one, guys.